Hello, everyone. Welcome to MetricStream's GRC 2020 Virtual Summit. I have the honor of introducing our first keynote speaker, Samantha Ravich. Let me just run through a highlight of a few of her accomplishments in her career. Samantha is currently chairman of the board, Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation, and she's vice chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. She's chairman of the Foundation for Defense Democracy's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation and its Transformative Cyber Innovation Lab. And she's also the principal investigator of the FDD's Cyber-Enabled Economic Warfare Project. She was appointed to the congressionally mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and she's also works with the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board. In the Bush administration, she served as a Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney, focusing on Asian and Middle Eastern affairs. She is an advisor and geopolitical advisor on threats and trends to numerous technology, manufacturing, and services companies, sitting on numerous corporate boards. Samantha is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and advises the U.S. Intelligence Community, as well as the Department of Defense. She received her PhD in policy analysis from the Rand School in California, and her master's and her bachelor's from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And today, she is going to speak on how to restart a country and the broader world after a major event. Samantha, you have an extremely impressive background. I am going to pass over to you now to share with the audience your thoughts on how to think about coming out of this pandemic crisis.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. And by here, of course, I only mean that in a sort of metaphysical kind of way. So today I want to talk a bit about risk, how to think about it, how to plan for it, how to mitigate it, and ultimately how to accept that risk is a fact of life. Next slide. Next slide, please. All right, I'll keep talking, but hopefully they'll, thank you. And what better time to talk about risk than during the great COVID crisis of 2020? As you will see in my brief remarks, the connection from today's crisis to how we must think about cyber risk going forward. And to discuss risk meaningfully entails talking about data, talking about assigning numbers and probabilities to events. What is the likelihood that the event will occur, and how painful or costly in lives or treasure will it be if it does? Next slide. So some of the numbers, the data floating around are total number of dead from COVID by the end of the year. Maybe 1 million, maybe less, hopefully. Government spending around the world, $7 trillion, more, less. A drop in global GDP, 3%, 5%, 8%. These numbers are truly horrible, catastrophic, and uncertain. But we must think about these numbers, even with the great level of uncertainty, because the way we decide to think about them and weigh them one against another will dictate how we make choices going ahead in this crisis and how to be prepared for the next one, potentially a cyber catastrophe. So I want to mention the life you save may be your own. For the readers out there, they may think of the author Flannery O'Connor, but I am actually referring to the Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling, who introduced the value of a statistical life concept in a 1968 essay, where he wrote, "Death is indeed different from most consumer events, and its avoidance different from most commodities. But most people have been dying for as long as they have been living. And where life and death are concerned, we are all consumers. We nearly all want our lives extended and are probably willing to pay for it." So Schelling thought of a way to calculate the trade-off between fatality risk and money. Everyone should become familiar with and learn to love that equation at the bottom of the slide, because it is of expected value. I'll get back to that. But back to COVID, and did it have to be this bad? And what about that reopening of the economy? Next slide. So why are we here? And did it have to be this bad? Probably not, frankly. But this is the problem with getting policymakers or business leaders or your parent or your spouse or your child to think through how to plan for and move through a crisis when all the choices are atrocious, right? Most people just do not like having to choose between horrible option A and horrific option B. And even the best companies are taking a look at their business continuity plans and realizing that their documents assume no more than 30 days of impact, not a prolonged crisis. So now what? Well, whether you are a policymaker, a business leader, a mother, you can always choose wisely, even if all the options are dreadful, because almost always one of the options will be less terrible than the others. And by working through the data, the probability of an option occurring or leading to its intended outcome and the cost of undertaking it will serve as the best guide. So one should never wing it when it comes for the preparation for, dealing with, and moving through a crisis. Next slide. So last word on COVID and reopening the economy. Again, all the choices presented to us will be bad. Most people, unfortunately, there will be more people, not most people, more people will likely get sick and die from this virus, right? But these numbers must be compared with the number of people that will also get sick and die separate and apart from coronavirus, from that 8x to Y% drop in GDP and the astronomical rise in unemployment. So my thoughts on opening up the economy, it will kind of be like what Ernest Hemingway once famously said about how he went bankrupt. Gradually, then suddenly. We will begin to have more data on how to evaluate the options of keeping closed or opening. And I think we will begin to take more risks, but hopefully more calculated ones. So how does all this relate to cyber? And what can we learn from the COVID crisis going forward? Next slide. How to evaluate risk? So risk, remember, entails a certain lack of knowledge. So Schelling was certainly not suggesting that you could pay X dollars and have no chance of dying for an endeavor. No, it is a trade-off. And evaluating risks takes both the right side and the left side of the brain. So for those of you who didn't like that expected value equation that I put up on an earlier slide, remember that there are qualitative measures that are crucial to consider as well, something that is often forgotten. So how to evaluate mitigation strategies? You need to ask the hard question, how much are we willing to try to pay to try to prevent this, right? Not prevent it, but try to prevent it. How much can we self-insure? How much redundancies in systems and supply chains does it make sense to incorporate? How much should we be looking outside to cyber insurance, for instance, for business interruption? And what happens when the event you dread really does occur? It will be bad, but planning and exercises and planning and exercising will make it less bad, and that will be good. Next slide, please. So the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act created the Congressional Cyberspace Solarium Commission to answer two fundamental questions. What strategic approach will defend the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequences? And what policies and legislation are required to implement that strategy? We were charged with thinking through cyber risk and how to mitigate it. I think we got it right when we opened the report with the warning, quote, "The reality is that we are dangerously insecure in cyber. A major cyber attack on the nation's critical infrastructure and economic system would create chaos and lasting damage exceeding that wreaked by the fires in California, flood in the Midwest, and hurricanes in the Southeast." And now I could also add COVID. Next slide. In the report, we document how from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea to extremist groups and criminals, a broad array of threat actors are exploiting global connectivity to achieve their objectives, such as North Korean cyber operators probing the networks of the United States and its allies, seeking to military plans, technology, and weapons system information, while identifying vulnerabilities in critical infrastructures for Pyongyang to exploit in a future crisis. Or Iran, cyber operations to undermine the U.S. deterrent posture, network of alliances in the Middle East. Or Russia using cyber capabilities, both to enhance military operations and to conduct nation operations campaigns designed to isolate their opponents, as well as probing critical infrastructure across NATO member states. And of course, China, waging cyber-enabled economic warfare. That was a term my Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation created, and it was used in the 2017 National Security Strategy. China using cyber-enabled warfare to fuel its rise while simultaneously undercutting U.S. economic and military superiority. The Cyber Solarium Commission report chronicles how Chinese cyber campaigns have enabled the theft of trillions of dollars in intellectual property. I'm confident that recommendations of the Commission will become law through the upcoming NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and perhaps an omnibus bill later on. But our strategy revolved around a concept we called layered deterrence, shaping behavior to promote responsible behavior in cyberspace, one layer, denying benefits to the adversary from any kind of hostile cyber activity, another layer, and imposing costs upon these adversaries if they do try to take these actions. And we underscored the need to think and act with speed and agility, since decisions mean next to nothing without the speed and agility to make and implement them. Two of the key planks in denying benefits, that part of layered deterrence, are continuity of the economy, also called COAT for shorthand, and cyber state of distress. Next slide. So it now seems quite prescient, but over the course of 2019, and in the work that we have done at Center for the last 4 years, we spent long hours thinking through how we could get our economy back up and if we faced a major cyber attack. We recognize the imperative to take those Cold War concepts of continuity of operation, also called Coop, and continuity of governance, also called COG, and update resilience and continuity to focus on the role of our economy. Because economic security is national security, and our adversaries understand, sometimes better than we do, that America's military strength rests on the shoulders of our economic wherewithal. So all last year during the Cyber Solarium Commission, we talked about how to make sure that our economy can absorb an attack and quickly restart. Think about it. Restart the economy. Right? Now it sounds familiar. Our congressional recommendation for continuity economy revolved around the following. First, prioritization. Right? Not all sectors, industries, businesses are of equal priority. In emergency planning, in the past, the banks and the grid were certainly given priority. But COVID has taught us a lot about the importance of distribution networks, of food supplies, of supplies. Second, we need to find areas where it makes sense to go back to analog. Function without the benefit of the internet. Third, we have to identify segments of the economy where we need to have data backups, seed data, like sheltered harbor, untouchable offline data vaults, so we can get compromised systems back online without data loss. Continuity of the economy planning should further explore options to store backup protected data across borders with allies or partners. particularly where economic disruption in either country could have cascading effects on the global economy. Cope into consideration the lack of readiness of the general public. Many industries will not be included in this planning, and most citizens will not be able to rely on government assistance in a period following such an attack. Again, I'm sure COVID is not about this. And finally, we wrote that to roll up all this into the creation of standard operating procedures and then conduct legal reviews and exercises to ensure we can employ our code efforts when a crisis occurs. So we spent a lot of time thinking about this worst case scenario, but we also thought about the opposite end of the spectrum. Next slide. We called it a cyber state of distress. We found that our country was unprepared for a cyber event that didn't cross the level of national disaster, something that was above routine, below an emergency declaration. So we created ways for a cyber state of distress to trigger the availability of additional resources, a cyber response and fund. Next slide. Companies and their boards can learn a lot from this report, and I encourage all of you to look at solarium.gov for the report in full, but also to think about the thinking that was behind it, because there is code in a corporate setting, right? So in particular, companies must ensure that the right people can think about risk, assigning probabilities of occurrence and cost if the event occurs. Again, quantitative and qualitative measures, but in a linear, logical way. Right? We also need the right people who can explain and discuss the trade-offs amongst options and help leadership recognize the risks they will be taking with their chosen options. Again, it might be where all options are bad. What is the least bad of those options? And how do you explain it to somebody who doesn't want to learn about what is in that every variable in the expected value equation? So you need to be able to convey that. The prioritization of business functions, supply chains, and their vendors. Analog versus digital. Today's environment, it might mean working at home in slippers, screaming children. Data backup and sheltered harbor. What data can be protected? How is it held offline? Even if you're not one of those largest sectors, most critical sectors, as we call them. And where do you stand in the government queue? Also known as get in line or go it alone. Next slide. The commission issued a clarion call for the American people to read the report and then demand that the government and the private sector act with speed and agility to secure our cyber future. And note the call out to the private sector. Without your active participation, we cannot safeguard our country. And so the report has numerous recommendations on how to both incentivize companies as well as compel them in some instances. So recommendations such as clarify liability for federally directed mitigation, response, and recovery efforts. The government is going to tell you to do something and you do it, there needs to be some sort of liability protection. But also establishing liability for final goods assemblers. And so it shouldn't be that the individual, the small company, has no way to know the cybersecurity of the devices and networks they're employing. It is not their responsibility. The commission says there should be some liability for final goods assemblers. But a lot of our recommendations will get passed into law. But even those that don't, private sector actors may want to undertake some of these guideposts on their own to harden the castle walls. And I would reiterate, the private sector has a voice in all of this. And frankly, it is not on the shoulder of the private sector to defend against a hostile nation-state adversary. That is the role of the U.S. government. Having said that, the private sector, it is in their best interest to harden their own ecosphere, to harden their own networks, and to ensure that in a time of a cyber crisis, they have thought through their own continuity of the economy planning. Next slide. So I will leave you with one final thought from the original The Life You Save May Be Your Own by Flannery O'Connor. This is great to keep in mind during these times, I think, because as she writes, our spirit is always on the move, although our bodies may still be in lockdown. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Samantha. That was excellent. So I think kind of on that last point, our house is steady, but our spirit is always on the move. I think one of the questions that the audience has is, with this crisis, with employees now working from home, my sense is that most companies and employees are going to want to maintain that kind of distributed virtual working environment, for many, many reasons, right? But from a cybersecurity perspective, how do you suggest companies think about balancing the requirements of protecting that castle wall that you called, and at the same time understanding what employees are dealing with in their environments, whether it's, sick family members or probably don't have the best tech in the world to begin with, right, in terms of how they're accessing, the company video conferencing solutions or emails. So could you tell us maybe like three criteria that you would want CISOs and the executives to keep in mind here?
Right. So first is definitely a discussion with the board on what parts of CapEx will be minimized during this time, right? There's a lot of focus on cutting costs, and there has to be because a lot of companies are in distress and need to survive this crisis. So yes, capital expenditures will be cut, but you also need to think about, you want your company to be able to protect its data going forward. So as you come out of this crisis, you have not cut the IT budget so much so that your intellectual property has gone out the door during this crisis. And that is a conversation between the C-suite and the board on what makes sense. Again, risk trade-off. What capital expenditures do you need to still go forward with? That IT modernization that was in the works, what can be stopped, what needs to be slowed down. The second, training. Clearly training of the workforce on how to use all of these new WebEx, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, what should be on the screen, what isn't safe to use. Training is critical. What links to click on, and there's going to be so many more COVID scams, we all know this. But mistakes will be made, right? It is a very stressful time for workforce. And if the workforce doesn't feel that they can then reach back to the company, the IT department and say, oh my God, I made a mistake. I really didn't mean to click on that link, but I did. Now what? The companies are going to be in a lot worse trouble if they don't signal to the workforce, yes, here's what you need to do if you're working at home, but mistakes will be made. Do not be afraid to step forward and say, there was a problem, I did this, I shouldn't have done it. People are afraid of losing their jobs. They will be much more hesitant to report if there is a problem. You need to encourage them to do that. And finally, unfortunately, there are lots of furloughs. And as soon as those furloughs take place, these people need to be taken off the system. It's tough, but it needs to be done because there will be people that are disgruntled, and you are opening yourself up to a vulnerability if you don't immediately end access for furloughed employees. There are other ways to have secondary ways to reach these people, personal cell phones, a different type of list that you can continue to communicate, but they should not be attached to your main system.
Oh, that's a good point. Hadn't thought about those, the furloughed individuals. So let's talk about key person risk, or sometimes I think historically known as key man risk, but I prefer to call it key person risk. You just talked about the weaknesses in the cyber infrastructure, and there obviously cybersecurity breaches are major risk, and there are even more bad actors now following the executives, right? So, and these executives have got iPhones and iPads, and they're working from home, and they probably have multiple environments that working from home setup is associated with. So what do you see as the risk associated with these key persons, and how do you think the CISOs should be thinking about protecting that asset or those assets?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, a study that we just completed, and it just got posted on fdd.org. We called it Project Vampire. So we started really being concerned 6, 9, 12 months ago, way before this, about high-level U.S. government officials walking out of the Pentagon, an agency, the White House, whatever, their cell phone potentially pinging a fake cell tower, adversaries being able to follow them home on their cell device, putting around that, knowing where they live and how they interact through their social media portfolios, and getting on their home networks. And so we started to look at the data, and this was pre-COVID. And in 2017, the last time the US government looked around and asked how many agencies had telework plans in place, only 26 out of 51 agencies had any type of teleworking plan. 43% of the 2.1 million US government workforce is able to work at home. The others are still kind of struggling. So we did a real-time pen test of a former government official, found that there was adversaries on their home network, and mitigated it. Right. Our message, and we have this out to the US government, is there needs to be almost like a geek squad. Prioritize not all government officials, but prioritize to make sure that their home networks of key employees that are working on with sensitive data or sensitive critical functions of the enterprise, their home networks are secure. And so there are commercially available home monitoring where the networks can be monitored. Of course, it's a balance with privacy, because if you're working at home, who else is on your network? Your spouse, your kids, your in-laws. If you're going to have a company monitoring your home network use, you have to make sure that privileges and awareness is in place. But those are the kind of things that must be balanced now. Monitoring of home networks, mitigating if there are problems, and again, not all people have to have this, but certainly working from home, key personnel, it is highly advisable.
Okay, so everybody remember FTD.com, Project Vampire. Check out that report, right?
Yes.
Or the FTD.org, that's it. Project Vampire. So that was, that's interesting.
Yeah, we called it Vampire because the bad guys come out at night, hence Vampire.
Oh, great. All right. So kind of along those lines, you and I talked about the fact that a large part of the workforce tends to be associated with SME firms, right? Firms with less than 5,000 employees. And I think it would be helpful if you could kind of outline what's kind of the skill set that those firms need to think about with their cyber teams, right? And how much of that are they going to be able to insource versus outsource? Because, an SME firm obviously doesn't have the balance sheet and the P&L, the operating budget that a global enterprise does, right, to protect their assets. But equally, they can be very vulnerable. So how would you recommend they kind of approach that type of risk, the cyber risk?
Yeah. So when looking at cyber risk, whether you have, 100 people, 5,000 people, 12,000 people, 100,000 people, cyber risk is not just in the purview of the CISO and the CTO, first of all, right? Because, and going back to that first point about furloughed employees and taking them off the system, HR is a critical component when you're talking about understanding enterprise-wide cyber risk. The second point about the privileges and getting on a home network, you're going to need legal and compliance in there as well. And so I think that the first thing to make sure is that cyber risk is an enterprise-wide risk, and it's taken seriously amongst various departments. It is not just shunted off to the CISO and the CTO. Your problem, you deal with it. Right there, you're going to have a big problem if you're a small, medium-sized enterprise, or if you're one of the largest enterprises. So once you get the team approach, understanding that there are a broader team that has to look at this problem, then you really start laying out where are the risks, what are our critical functions, who are our critical people, what are our critical systems. Because if there is a major cyber event, I can assure you that different parts of the enterprise will have different understanding of what needs to be brought up first. Right, so I'll give you an example from a company that I knew in the past. They had a very busy time of year. It was during 1 month in the spring, very, very busy. That was when all their critical functions and the quote cyber team decided that was a great time to patch. And lo and behold, they were taking down systems during, one of the operational elements' most critical time, right? Because they just had not kind of seen it as the enterprise-wide. So once you have all the different risk factors, of course, wrapping a framework around it, whether it's NIST or something else. In the small, medium-sized enterprises, you don't have to do everything in-house. There is this belief that if we kind of outsource, there's something lame about us, that we have to have a crack cyber, the best of breed cyber. Well, maybe you need the best of breed working with outside vendors, and that might be a very different skill set. Because that might be the way you best protect, especially, if you make water bottles or you make, hospital gear or you are a food distributor. You're not a cyber firm. Now, you need to have a skill set inside that can work with outside vendors and ask the right questions, which gets to the point of ask the hard questions of your third-party vendors. This is really important for small, medium-sized enterprises, right? So sometimes if you're, let's say, hiring a very large law firm, they may not be prioritized for the law firm. Right? The law firm might be working with those Fortune 100 companies a little more rigorously than with the SMEs. The SMEs have every right to demand to know how are the cybersecurity protocols of the lawyers, of their accountants. Their most critical information is going through their law firms or going through their accounting firms. They have absolutely every right to demand to know how is that data protected and what is the cybersecurity protocol of their third-party vendors, especially now when they're working at home, right? Gets back to what we were talking about before. The final point I just want to make is testing and doing live fire exercises, doing tabletops. It's a little bit like gardening, which I guess we're all doing during COVID times. You have to weed and then they grow back, and then you have to weed again and they grow back. It never ends. And so with testing and tabletop exercises, I'll turn back.
Yeah. Oh gosh, good old tabletops. Come back to that. I actually saw a colonel one time over here in the UK, British colonel actually present on doing tabletops. And he says this is one of the reasons that he felt that the Army was much better at resilience than average corporate, because they don't practice their tabletops enough. In Army, that's in the military, that's what you do, right? You constantly practice. So you're prepared for the event. And corporates, he say, don't do it enough.
And people change out. It is absolutely my experience. You find, and so doing the tabletop once, but then if you've replaced key people in your C-suite, that's not good anymore. You got to redo it.
So we're getting a number of questions from the people in the audience. So let me kind of ask you this one. So someone's asking, is terrorism actually taking advantage of COVID-19 to really disrupt peace in the world? And based on your response, how do you think governance, risk, and compliance professionals can actually help in this regard? Not in terms of supporting terrorism, obviously, but in terms of minimizing that activity.
Yeah, look, the problems in the world haven't stopped because many of us are in lockdown, right? I haven't seen the manual for the ISIS lockdown response. I don't know what they're actually telling ISIS all over the world to social distance. Probably not. The problems in Syria and the Middle East, what's going on in Iran, other places are continuing. we're just not getting a lot of that in the popular news because we're dealing with what we're doing with here.
Mhm.
Should I continue?
Yeah,
Yeah, all good?
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, it's good. Go ahead.
All right, I'm hearing the other. Okay, will do. Right. So terrorism is continuing. I haven't seen a lot of how they are taking advantage of this time, but I imagine that they are because resources that would have been devoted to breaking up terrorist networks, some of them have been diverted. But from what I understand inside the U.S. government, I mean, the law enforcement, the intelligence community who has been focusing on these continues to focus on them.
Okay. And we have time for one more question. And you might have touched on this a bit earlier. We sort of touched on it in your presentation. So third parties and vendors. So some firms that I've been speaking with are thinking about, well, they're looking at their supply chain and they're thinking, should we be pulling more of these things back onshore, near shore, particularly if they're in countries that have been really disrupted by the pandemic. What do you think are the factors that companies need to think about when moving third party, changing their third party programs around and their vendor programs around and pulling those back into, whether they should pull them back in-house or potentially pull them near shore and look at other providers?
Yeah, so I just want to kind of answer that first on the highest level, which is supply chain and supply chain resiliency, right? If there is any silver lining, and it's very hard to say because it's a very difficult time for many people, but if there is any silver lining on COVID, it is going to finally have our eyes open to what especially our defense industrial based supply chain looks like. We have to get a handle on it. We have to understand, who is 3, 4, 5 levels down in the supply chain, because rupture that and you see the ripples very, very clearly. So the first part, again, data. We need to understand who is in the supply chain. It's unbelievable how many companies have no idea who are in their critical functions or system supply chain. So getting a handle on that and demanding down one level, okay, what does your critical function supply chain look like? And then, again, prioritizing. Not everything can be brought onshore. Right? You're not going to spend every last dollar on cybersecurity. That doesn't make any sense. Then you don't have any other money to have the company go forward. But you will have to make choices. And cybersecurity insurance might be, we think in the commission and otherwise that this is going to be a very big burgeoning field, especially for business interruption and supply chain interruption. Right? You can outsource some of the risk, and that's what insurance is about. So a cyber security disruption where your main customer, the government, says pencils down because there's been a breach. The biggest threat to companies is that they don't have the working capital to continue while their pencils are down. That's what we're seeing. Again, COVID is a live fire. They don't have the money to continue because they aren't bringing any money in. So on the cyber side, cybersecurity insurance is something that even small and medium-sized enterprises might need to take a much more serious risk. That the insurance market is becoming much more mature.
Wow, that will be a great option, particularly I think for the SME market. So this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Samantha, and everyone. Samantha Ravich, it's been a pleasure. And now we're going to turn over to the panel. I think you're joining a panel being run by Gaurav Kapoor, our COO, and we'll let you go and you can join that panel. But thank you so much for your presentation.
My pleasure.